My name is Adam Cohen. I am a professor in the Department of Art History here at the University of Toronto and a member of the faculty at the Anne Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies, where I also serve as the coordinator for the undergraduate program. But I'm here in my capacity as an art historian to introduce our wonderful speaker for today. Now, some of you may have been wondering why you got more than one announcement about this event. And there was some internal confusion. Professor Hornstein knew from the beginning what she was going to do, but we had a little confusion. But it gives me an opportunity to share an anecdote that I learned from my mentor. We were trying to come up with a speaker series, and some of the graduate students were saying, well, we want this topic or we want that topic. And we were trying to think of speakers who would be suitable for that. And he said, no. That's not how you do it. Get good people and let them talk about whatever they want. And I think that that's what we have in store for us today. Shelley Hornstein is a senior scholar and emerita professor of architectural history and urban culture at York University. And she is a prolific and a brave scholar who has tackled truly one of the most difficult topics that we all confront, which is the Holocaust and how it is remembered and imagined and commemorated in the public sphere. And she has published several books on the subject. If I read them all, she wouldn't have any time to talk. I'll just mention Impossible Images, Contemporary Art After the Holocaust from NYU Press in 2003, Losing Sight, Architecture, Memory, and Place in 2011, and her forthcoming book is called Architectural Tourism, Sightseeing, Itineraries, and Cultural Heritage, and it will be published very soon by Lund Humphreys in the United Kingdom. And this is going to be the springboard, as I understand it, for Professor Hornstein's talk, one that will chart the complexities of museum architecture, and in particular, the architecture of Jewish museums in Europe today. So whatever talk you thought you were getting, sit back, you're in for a real intellectual treat. And so without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Shelley Hornstein.
Thank you so much, Adam. I don't know what to say. That was wonderful. I hope I can live up to your introduction. And with that, I'm going to immediately do some technology here and share my screen. So give me a moment and we'll get this set up, I hope. One more click or two. There we go. All right, it looks like it might work.
You're in business.
Okay. Now, I want to talk about the stories we tell, tourist narratives in the architecture of Jewish museums, as you can see on this image. And with a title like this, and during our extended time at home with only a memory of travel, you might be asking yourselves if I'm about to present you with a stunning visual slideshow or virtual tour of Jewish museums. But instead, I want to speak to you about the architecture of museums, specifically Jewish museums, and the impact that they have on tourist itineraries and ultimately the stories that we tell each other. What I'd like to do is to parse out the complexities of the role of architecture and notably the architecture of museums as it tells a story about identities, but more importantly, today, the architecture of Jewish museums as one of the binding agents, the glue of a place, the site specificity object that is the key to how we perceive nuanced stories of identity. We're looking here on the left at the Danish Jewish Museum with its addition, both outside and inside, to a historic building by Daniel Libeskind. And on the right, the Jewish Museum of Greece, not a purpose-built museum in the center of Athens. That site specificity object that I mentioned to you, how we perceive stories of identity, character, history, politics, geopolitics, and culture in city space is what is most important, therefore, for a tourist's itinerary. How do we perceive these stories as residents, on the one hand, of a particular place, to be sure, but primarily as tourists, because ultimately we are all tourists, where the dominant belief system overwhelms. For armed with our cameras, especially in our phones these days, we are all tourists. And as Susan Sontag has famously told us, the camera makes everyone a tourist in other people's reality and eventually in one's own. Now, I'll be discussing Jewish museums primarily in Europe, of course, as a telling cluster of case studies. And I focus on Europe in particular because of the revival of Jewish museums that occurred after the Shoah and the efforts by those communities that were decimated or erased to set into motion a memorial project, largely, in the hope of encouraging maybe a revival, maybe a restoration, maybe a revisit, maybe a reset, and perhaps even a remodeling of the Jewish past. To what extent, then, can a Jewish museum contribute to the discourse on Jewish identity and memory? How does a Jewish museum, its location specifically, participate in the formulation of nationhood and belonging on the soil, on the very soil where it rises? And all this within the context of tourism. Indeed, the only global tool I want to suggest to make this work. And does it work? And perhaps we can have that discussion later on. In my last book, I mused on the subject of tourists who are both nomads and curators, because we, as tourists, all of us, craft cultural itineraries as we construct our visits. I wrote that even if we have never visited the Louvre, and I'm sure you're wondering why this is up here, well, if we have never even visited the Louvre in Paris, or for that matter, the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain, the frozen snapshot that you're looking at right here of each of those architectural monuments, museum/monuments, is what comes to mind rather than any one of the paintings, let's say, in the collections housed within their prodigious walls, which is what I'm suggesting. And the image that we might conjure up when thinking about any one of those museums or places is likely of the building itself or the site itself. The architecture and the architectural place, therefore, and decidedly, I want to argue, decidedly, not the contents. And if this is so, then the architecture, the buildings, the forms that create the spaces in which we perform everyday life are critical to evaluating what a place means and the stories that we formulate and tell about it. Museums and tourism are inextricably bound together. Museums as structures are, in many instances, tourist attractions that challenge the histories and memories of the urban collective. Museums beckon the potential visitor, both the tourist and the local alike, through the aestheticization and cultural branding that serve to narrativize urban space. Because museums, I think, shout existence. The more there are, the more that society is affirmed. And so it follows that for Jewish museums, they matter. They represent a rooted presence and a material proof of Jewish existence in what has been all too often an uprooted past. And in the international framework of Jewish museums in Europe, attempting to reclaim physical space in order to present history and contemporary culture in places not always welcoming, I'm reminded, anecdotally, of the soon approaching, once we're through with the high holidays, the soon approaching festival of Hanukkah, and the collision course that Jews have with Christmas in particular as an abstract metaphor for physical museal place. For it seems that no matter how hard we try we are confronted time and again with that thorny confusion or holiday fusion that goes something like this. Well, you know, we celebrate Hanukkah and you guys have Christmas, or perhaps a fruitless explanation of how Hanukkah is not a religious holiday. Don't equate it, please, with Christmas. It's not about presents and present exchanges, and our other holidays far outweigh this one in importance. But, well, you know, Hanukkah is fun. And this equation tends to smooth out that rough divide, and I'm going to underscore rough divide, however briefly, at least in the month of December, at least between, in this particular instance, between Christians and Jews. But that fusion, particularly rampant in North America, points to the success of assimilation or of merged interests, especially in favor of at least what has been up till now the dominant religion. Along with the merged holidays is a sense that the fusion of identities and identity places should eventually be agglomerated as well, even though it's not so much a religious syncretism as it is an acquiescence. Identities, I think, scramble to either become one by submission and domination, or instead break apart, as we've seen quite often, and divide into multiple, even stronger fractions. I think the desire to build a Jewish museum comes out of a desire to do just this, declare identity and celebrate it. Yet it proves to be a task, especially in Europe today. As Suzanne Weiss has put it in an article she wrote back in 2003 called Klezmer's Hot in Poland, she said, in Krakow, you can find a good kosher meal, a number of klezmer bands, Jewish cabaret, art exhibits, and folk dancing. The only thing you probably won't find, unless you look very hard, are Jews. In order to broach architecture and museums, then, we must consider geography and place. Religious divides continue to define the global landscape and can be qualified and quantified by geography. Now, here we're looking at the Association of European Jewish Museums map of the member museums. It doesn't account for all the museums, just those that are members, but I thought it would be interesting for you to take a look. Some are much larger than others. I'm going to come back to this in certain aspects. The places in Europe, then, that mark where Jewish communities celebrate are different today. For Jews, those places that were once vibrant with Jewish community life are now mute or no longer speak in the language or communities that they once did. Yet, they've not been entirely extinguished. Jewish communities have left something behind, as you can see from the removal of the mezuzah on the door jamb here. Place, then. Place and sometimes architecture. Place and sometimes tombstones. Place still exists, although sometimes it is difficult to retrieve or even know. But place above all, those of us tourists and locals alike who wish to recognize that lost past struggle sometimes with enormous difficulty to resurrect the life-likeness that once animated those places. Sometimes the emptiness is so hollow in that resurrection, as Suzanne Weiss laments in her quote, that what fills the hole feels empty itself. And the rituals and the reconstructions, the revivals and the reenactments play on the theme of what once was in ways that perpetuate that sense of loss. Now, Shelley Hornstein describes this as Disney diasporas, by which he means something similar to what Umberto Eco described when he was writing about Disneyland in Hyperreality, his book Hyperreality. His essay describes Disneyland as recreations and themed environments, and where what he called absolutely realistic, or what he also called completely real, is, to quote him, identified with what is completely fake, or a hyper-reality. When Salamansky describes the mountain village of Hervás in Spain, and we're looking here at a portion of the festival of Los Conversos, this one in 2018, but it's held annually, that this annual Jewish festival, it should be said, by the way, that Hervás counted approximately 40 Jews, or Jewish families maybe, before 1492. Anyways, she remarks that the festival, as the villagers contend, to quote her, is really just a fantasy designed to attract tourist income to a town with stunning architecture and views, but little employment. She continues, in Hervas, the evocation of a Jewish past is so perfunctory and historically fanciful as to border on the offensive. Stars of David adorn street signs, window grates, and even, for no clear reason, the church. There is a Juderia tavern and a hotel spa, I should add, synagoga. The former, on inspection, specializing in ham, she tells us, the latter indistinguishable from a Holiday Inn. On arrival, she says, I was amused by the kitsch, but by my last day, I felt vaguely sick. The empty symbolism cruelly underscored all that Europe has lost. This sadness is real, but Jews or those immersed in Jewish studies, like many here today, have learned, or at least are attempting to combat over time, how to reclaim that past without kitsch, a challenge indeed, and that is without a reliance on the aspects of Judaism so familiar to our detractors. The idea of recovery or reinvention, as Sidra Dehova Mizrahi tells us, is, as she puts it, an interpretive strategy that assigns special meaning in the present to an act or event of the past. And if that past is partial or destroyed, its power only increases, as philosopher Edward Casey has told us. For Jewish tourists, continues Mizrahi, discourse on home, exile, and return captures the intensified longing for a place of origin as ultimate reference or antecedent, the presumption of a paradise whose loss or absence preserves it in a kind of negative space. Perhaps we can label this as a sort of shtetlization, or a recreation of fantasy, or a fantasy of a shtetl, I should say, or a lost Jewish community, that locks us into a burdensome centripetal force spinning from nostalgia or longing for the loss based on a shared sense of history to reinvention of that history and around again. We're looking here at the Singer Cafe in a neighborhood of Krakow and Kazimierz, one of the many revival themed places in that area of town, the former Jewish area of the town. And many of the renewed Jewish quarters or geographies or tourism stakeholders invoke this pattern. In fact, mine it, as we see here, as a commodifiable object. It's difficult to wade through strategies of remembrance and commemoration when one is tasked with the objective of bringing any one of these lost Jewish communities to the fore. Take, for example, also the Lost Shtetl Museum. It's a project designed now by the architectural firm, and I'm going to mess up the pronunciation here, Ladelma and Malamaki, who were the architects of the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw as well. This time, the Lost Shtetl Museum is in Szyduwa in Lithuania. It's projected to open in 2022. It's been a project since 2012. And as the website tells us, and I'm quoting the website, museum visitors will be taught the tragedy of Szyduwa's Jewish history, which ended in 3 pits near the shtetl in the early days of World War II, concluding 5 centuries of the history of the Jews of Szyduwa. And elsewhere, Ruth Ellen Gruber, who champions the website that you see here on the right, Jewish Heritage Europe, and who wrote on the left, Virtually Jewish, Reinventing Jewish Culture in Europe, back in 2002, Ruth Ellen Gruber examines such appropriated and virtually imagined or even reimagined Jewish spaces. She documents these as places where Jews have made up only a fraction of the population, if at all. And she charts this kind of remarkable trend that we've been seeing of non-Jews who are overjoyed, enthusiastic about reviving and sustaining facets of Jewish cultural life in Europe. And Erika Lehrer takes up the notion of Jewish Disneylands as well when discussing Krakow, or precisely Kazimierz, by suggesting a way through them. What she proposes is to build on Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblet's concept of the interface. Barbara tells us, and I'm quoting her, that the interface is between traditions and tourism, connecting us to heritage productions up to the present. And so for her part, Lehrer suggests that this is done through people, through conversations, through interactions. And both Lehrer and another, Geneviève Zabriskie, have convincingly argued for the possibility of a conciliatory Jewish heritage, or what Zabriskie calls symbolic boundary making, referring specifically to contemporary Poland and the growing interest in Jews and all things Jewish, in an attempt by specific political and social groups to build a pluralistic society in what is an ethnically and denominationally homogeneous nation state. And we know this has been increasingly the case. Here I'm showing you an image of the Anatevka cafe restaurant in Łódź in Poland, actually, as one of those examples. And therefore, the power of the interface that I mentioned a few moments ago, or the performative aspects of community, is to provide, of course, some sort of meaning. And for any search for meaning to begin, though, we need to, I think, take that deeper dive into the physical sites, into the thickness of place, and what a material presence of Jewishness is in a place and what it's all about. Now, to point that out and to begin that conversation, what happens when we do a Google search? And as you can see, what I've put in the Google bar, search bar, is architecture of Jewish museums. So if we do that Google search of architecture of Jewish museums, I did not put in there architecture of the Jewish Museum Berlin. I put in architecture of Jewish museums, not its contents, the architecture. Hundreds of sites do come up. I'm showing you only the first page of that search. Hundreds of sites populate the Google list, but all of them are devoted to only one building, as you can well see here, and that is, yes, the Jewish Museum Berlin. Now, museums are conceived to showcase within their exhibition spaces history, heritage, culture, visual arts, and so on from various points of view. But the container of the museum is not just about the optics of the building. Museum architecture, as I've said before, is about its place, its insertion, its contribution, its dialogue, its performance, its GPS-ness, its responsiveness to visitors as they consider the urban context. While some argue that architecture's value is really more about it being embodied in its process, and not in its final result, in other words, in the built form. The thing that contributes, I want to argue that the thing that contributes or becomes the object, becomes the product, the thing that contributes to the ecosystem of a place, a city, a landscape, is what frames the cultural destination and gives it its life. That result, that legacy, and its aggregation with other object legacies in city spaces is how we seek out and develop a conversation within a city and how that narrative begins to evolve. As an aside and a compelling example, I can't help but think about the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto with its addition by, yes, once again, Daniel Libeskind here on the left, what had been projected as a glorious architecture project, at least on paper, and beautifully photographed for magazines, provides somewhat of a different sense of space and meaning in its urban context when we actually walk around and about this museum. And I remember vividly how people would ask me my opinion about the Royal Ontario Museum, and whether or not I believed that as one walks by this building, it's possible to be skewered by its pointy angles. So it just gives you a sense of the kind of anthropomorphic resonance that this building tends to have. And I use this only as an example to show you the difference between a photographic example that is usually devoid of people on the left and one that has people actually in it. At this point, let me return to my focus on Jewish museum architecture in Europe today. And of course, those of us who have visited Jewish museums in Europe or Jewish sites, be it a plaque, such as the one you're looking at here, or a memorial site, such as the one you're looking at here. And by the way, a little aside, this is the site or the monument to the incinerated and razed synagogue of Strasbourg by the Nazis in September of 1940. But moreover, it's about the vandalism that took place whereby this piece of granite had been dislocated from its plinth very recently, to show you an example of the ways in which these memorials, these sites, these memorial sites tend to continue to evoke resonance within city space. So we are all familiar with the emotional incentive to reclaim these places on the one hand, and we do that sometimes through memorials, we do that in other ways through architecture, or the historical rectitude that has been returned to the site that one feels when visiting such places. Since 2001, the Rothschild Foundation in Europe has allocated funds to preserve, as they put it, to preserve, strengthen, and make European Jewish cultural heritage more accessible. Jewish cultural heritage is culture in the broadest sense: art, history, literature, religious practices, whether it is tangible, such as through books, objects, and documents, or, as they continue to put it in their literature, intangible, including such things as music, teachings, and rituals. Museums, along with archives, libraries, synagogues, and schools, in other words, mostly tangible built forms, are among the key institutions that fulfill their mission. Brigitte Sion, who is Museum Program Director at the Rothschild Foundation Europe, wrote a comprehensive report, you can see the cover of it here, on Jewish museums in Europe published in 2016, that tackles many of the questions previously unknown about museums and their programs, and succeeds in provoking further discussion about where they go from 2016 forward. And in a post-national and transcultural world, and excuse me, Jewish museums are updating their galleries to reflect a reinterpretation of the Jewish experience through the lens of migration and cultural diversity. So Jewish museums are serving wider audiences all the time that they realize they need to attract and to engage. Now, while her study explicitly describes a vast range of complex museal questions, Jewish museum architecture per se is not included in the report, and for cause. There is far too much to assess from the raw material she culled having to do with Jewish museums in Europe otherwise, such as their programs, their education mandates, their exhibitions, their audiences, and so on. So in light of this, let's remove the various functions a Jewish museum might fulfill, particularly on the inside. And what do we have left? We have a Jewish museum's siting, its place, its materiality, and its presence. We have its conversation with other buildings, with the streets, with the sidewalks, with tourists, with locals, with political boundaries. And for Jewish museums in Europe, it is also a dialogue with symbolic sites or heritage properties, and for those sites no longer present. For Jewish museums in Europe are far different from those in Canada and the United States. And I might add that we have no official national Jewish museum in Canada. We have smaller Jewish museums located generally within synagogues or cultural spaces. And there's one that I'll mention in Montreal. I'll mention it a little further along. But we have no national museum. We have no major purpose-built Jewish museums as exist in the United States, for example. Now, Amos Oz recounts in his A Tale of Love and Darkness that his parents waxed bittersweet about Europe, a place that triggered conflicting emotions. He tells how they described, and I'm quoting him here, the blandishments of Europe as that wonderful, murderous continent. So we're caught betwixt and between all the time within Europe, which is a very different scenario, very different geography from the United States and Canada. And because so many of the places that defined Jewish geographic sites were demolished, erased, or damaged, the connection to place intensifies. We seem to have a reliance on architecture, generally speaking, as something that is always there, something that is always in our midst. And even though we're well aware of the fact that destruction occurs due to natural causes, such as earthquakes, among others, and also there is intentional erasure through demolition, still we turn to those buildings and places as vectors that continue always to provide and secure meaning. The Jewishness of a Jewish museum gets down to the nitty-gritty about scales of difference in social space, social city space, between Jewish neighborhoods and others. And rather than a museum as such, but rather a Jewish museum, and suddenly tourists who were otherwise unaware of their immediate surroundings are considerably more attuned when they come up to a Jewish museum to that which is worthy of a detour, as the Michelin guide coined it for restaurants and sites. I love to use that expression, that it is worth a detour. Ça vaut le détour, as you see on the right. Anecdotally, the new Lisbon Jewish Museum was to be built into the fabric of an existing site in the Alfama quarter in the city. However, after considerable pushback by locals in that neighborhood to the idea that the building would be returned to a site of remembrance of that former Jewish ghetto, the project organizers decided to avoid controversy, to avoid the pushback they were experiencing, and to seek out another location. Instead, it will be built in the Belém neighborhood. For those who are familiar with Lisbon, it is in the same neighborhood as the glorious Mat Museum, which aligns the riverbank. And fundraising is currently in full swing for, yes, a Libeskind design. His work seems to be the theme of the day. And yet this brings me into a consideration of form. Whereas museums not only mark, but have become iconic presences in cities as architectural monuments, Jewish museums, by contrast, have had a conflicted relationship, I want to suggest, to iconicity. And I want to sharpen the focus on this aspect in relationship to some of the more stark-architectural, purpose-built Jewish museum projects, such as the Jewish Museum Berlin that you see here in this image, or the Polin, the Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw, and perhaps even more recently, the bold project entitled or named the World's Jewish Museum in Tel Aviv, initiated by Canada's Gail Asper from Winnipeg, the Winnipeg family, whose father, you may recall, Izzy Asper, is responsible for having dreamt of the Museum of Human Rights, which was eventually built and opened in 2008. This World's Jewish Museum aims to cross all transnational boundaries and speak globally to all Jewish peoples, histories, and accomplishments. I'm reading from the website, and will be designed by Frank Gehry, who you may know designed the Guggenheim Bilbao that we looked at earlier in Spain, and who also designed the Fondation Louis Vuitton that you see below, branded these two buildings, which is in Paris, on the image below. And let me read to you the website text that I think galvanizes many of my thoughts today. Frank Gehry, born Frank Goldberg, that's important to think about, widely recognized as one of the world's great modern architects, has been commissioned for the project. The Pritzker Prize-winning architect, whose work is aesthetically refined yet adventurous and animated, has been the force behind some of the world's most iconic, I'm underscoring the word iconic, structures. His design of the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao gave rise to the term the Bilbao effect, where whereby an iconic, there we have it again, architectural statement has a significant impact on tourism, investment, and economic growth. The proverbial, if you build it, they will come. And when it opened in '98, Philip Johnson, the father of modernism and postmodernism architecture, called Gehry the greatest architect we have. And the new Guggenheim Bilbao, the greatest building of our time. Over 1 million visit the museum annually. And I think what this tells us is that in the context of Jewish museums, the notion of attracting tourists based on architectural icons certainly has been less a thing for Jewish museums than it has been for other museums internationally. And so, do Jewish museums aim to compete then with other museums with regard to their star power architecturally, even when it amounts to a collective of buildings, say in a ghetto or cultural cluster setting? How does a national Jewish museum architecture play out relative to municipal or localized Jewish museums? And to wit, I'm showing you an image here of the Jewish Museum of Art and History in Paris on the right, and the Jewish Historical Museum in Amsterdam, both considered Jewish museums in a national sense, versus the Jewish Museum of Rome on the left, which is not a national museum and is actually tucked well within the synagogue within Rome, versus on the right, the newest National Museum of Italian Judaism and the Shoah, which is in Ferrara in Italy and opened last year. I believe it was 2019, perhaps the end of 18. Does this in some way take up the notion of national museums generally outside of the realm of Jewish museums versus local museums, as if to suggest there is a hierarchy? And by the way, I can use the example of the Art Gallery of Ontario versus the National Gallery of Canada, if we think about it outside the context of Jewish museums for a moment, because of course the National Gallery of Canada is just that, it's a national museum. It's our Canadian National Museum. The Art Gallery of Ontario is not a national museum. It's located in Toronto. It's an Ontario museum. And there is officially a hierarchy there. One can ask oneself how they work in conjunction with each other. And so this comes back to my question about Jewish museums and whether or not there is a hierarchy established between say the new museum in Ferrara and the Jewish Museum of Rome, the museum in Florence, the museum in Bologna, and so on. Does this in some way, how does the architecture of such national museums inculcate the notion of that hierarchy? In other words, if it's bigger, is it more comprehensive, and so on? The Jewish Museum in Berlin is bigger, the Amsterdam Museum is bigger, the Warsaw Museum is bigger than most other museums. And furthermore, does the cluster of physical Jewish sites that mark, therefore, the sites of Jewish history count for inclusion of a museification of Jewish place? And when I say that, I'm referring specifically to ideas or clusters such as the Venice Ghetto cluster on the left, or similarly the Juderia in Toledo on the right, where tourism has typically been keen to be inclusive of these sites as clusters to mark tourist itineraries, kind of museum clusters, if you will, for Jewish heritage sites. Or the recently formed Jewish Cultural Center in Barcelona, opened in 2018 at the Casa Adret, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, described as a torchbearer site for contemporary Jewish identity. Let me move ahead to one side, I'll come back to the other one in a moment. Two of the leaders of the Jewish Cultural Center in Barcelona, Victor Sorensen and Manuel Valentin, serve on the board also of the European Association for the Preservation and Promotion of Jewish Culture and Heritage. And its project, just to come back to this image, is one of their projects is Parallel Traces, a new lens on Jewish heritage, which sets out to rediscover as you can see here, rediscover traces of Jewish cultural heritage in urban architecture as an integral part of European history, and to raise awareness and respect amongst different cultures through different mechanisms, through tangible and intangible sites and projects. And some of these intangible heritage events include underground cooking of evenings and neighborhood walks. Once we get back to moving across the pond, we might be able to benefit from some of these events. But we also see a similar structure of museum, in a sense, in the Museum of Jewish Montreal, and I thought I'd show that to you here, where just one screen grab from their website tells us about the various walking tours that they have available. It's a museum that is essentially intangible and bases itself much more so on the events that it holds. But also there are concerts that are held, such as one that I attended when the Association of European Jewish Museums was held in Toledo, and where we were all enchanted to attend a concert by artists who are reclaiming ancient or Jewish historic music. Take, for example, Anna Al-Qaid, who is playing the nickel harpa to reinterpret traditional Sephardic songs in the El Transito Synagogue and now museum that you see here, built by Samuel Halevi, advisor and treasurer to King Pedro I of Castile from 1350 to 1369. And let me give you a little musical interlude. I'm so sorry to interrupt that for you, but of course you can, I can tell you later where you can get her music if you're interested. It was such a beautiful concert. So finally, who are the tourists who visit Jewish sites? And while studies have been conducted, and Ruth Ellen Gruber, as I mentioned earlier, has been tracking this, these sites are increasingly available for touristic consumption in a globalizing world, where otherness and difference are given considerable airtime to ward off the concept of exoticism or kitsch that I mentioned earlier for these sites. To this end, we know of the various Jewish heritage itineraries produced that give ample web space to reconstructing a sense of the Jewish past and possibly the present in Europe. But how do these itineraries connect our thoughts to the constructed environment or the urban cultural clusters distinguished by their physical footprints? What we celebrate with Daniel Libeskind's Jewish Museum Berlin is the architectural monumentality. And I mean both the scale and the size of the building itself, and the intentionality conveyed by its size, rising in Berlin shortly after the completion of the Guggenheim Bilbao. But what we also celebrate is its siting, for it's thanks to the attention, perhaps even the laser focus attention to place, that the museum resonates, I think, so profoundly, because it crosses the Berlin Wall. It dialogues with geography, with the geopolitical dimensions of Berlin, then and now, of its history and of its place. Until then, we hadn't explored such a typology of Jewish museum, at least a purpose-built Jewish museum of that scale and monumentality, of its meaning, of its geography, of its place, other than those museums that had been built in connection to a synagogue and a community. That is, in the grandeur and the international media attention as well that it garnered, both before it was shaped as a visual, physical form seen from the outside, but also on the inside as well. And as we know, of course, many, particularly smaller Jewish museums and synagogues outside main city centers actually found refuge in the dark corners of cities, in the spatially undesirable and parsimonious pockets, rather than on trophy property. So that if we want to zero in on the touristic mechanics of Jewish museums, I think it behooves us to set out an itinerary of discovery, of sleuthing for that which is not necessarily in plain sight, while acknowledging the value of the grand national statements that emerge out of a sometimes different sort of impetus. Architectural built environments, those physical cultural clusters, or what a tourist witnesses or experiences at any given site, anchors any preconceived idea of that place, or can be entirely formulated and subsequently cemented during the visit to that physical place. Not really a pun intended. And so one is always struck or shaped or impressed or primed or given directions by a physical object as a vector, in place, on place, by architecture or architectural settings. And perhaps one of the most salient examples of constructed narratives for us that can help us to segue into how meaningful architectural narratives are for a Jewish museum might be a story that many of you, I'm sure, know, and I may be singing into the wind, but might be a myth or authenticity story of Masada, where the protracted siege of the Sicari by the Roman legion became hopeless, as many of you know, and was ultimately the story of mass suicide of nearly 1,000 Jewish zealots, a story documented by Flavius Josephus. But the tourist tale hits a snag when we read Yael Zerabuvel, when she argues in Recovered Roots of 1995 how crucial it was to examine the construction of an Israeli national narrative in the years prior to the birth of the state. She argues how Zionist settlers consciously aimed to rewrite Jewish history by intervening in how Jewish memory would be shaped. And she points out how competing agendas determined the commemorative interpretations of history and opposing moral claims to transform events into heroic myths. And this is an important example of how place shapes stories and how those stories are created as a dynamic interplay between histories, history, singular, histories, plural, politics, traditions, and so on, and carry on for throngs of tourists who to this day yearn to visit the site of this drama or any other drama and their enduring myths. Dean McCannell, anthropologist and tourism mentor, Dean McCannell's canonical work on tourism underscores the importance of what he calls the ceremonial ratification of authentic attractions as objects of ultimate value. A ratification, he says, that was caused by and resulting in a gathering of tourists around an attraction and measurable to a certain degree by the time and the distance the tourists travel to reach it. But he carries on pointing out that what he says, the actual act of the communion between the tourist and the attraction is less important than the image or the idea of society that the collective act generates, and thereby the narratives that I'm referring to. As such, the traveler then is an independent curator, carving out a vision from a targeted or random selection of sites to see. And while it is crucial to recognize for tourists the role of the materiality of place that I've been harping on endlessly today, or the random selection of sites to see, the role of materiality of place and its attendant authenticity, as McCannell makes clear, it is just as important to validate the experience of the imagination and the power of visual culture in informing that desire for a place. And that is done largely today, especially in our immobile states, through online images and movies and television and novels and stories told to us by friends and family. And this is the case then, even if a tourist then, as we've experienced recently, never leaves home. Those narratives only strengthen. And so, to conclude, rather ironically, if we are to reconsider how physical, material place is the glue of the tourist experience, and that architecture is an intrinsic part of how that place is read into the tourist narrative, we can say that Jewish museums, whether making a bold, star-studded physical pronouncement, or tucked into a corner of a shtetl or a juderia, sets the stage for the performative relays with the tourist that evolve into a story about place. No doubt then that Jewish museums mark strategically where we are and organize the way in which we link Jewish history to a site, how we recollect what we tell about our experiences in a particular place, the stories we learn and with which we engage or engender and document through social media or other forms of dissemination about our having been there, as we recount to others about a place. Our stories convey ultimately how much architecture, the silent influencer, in spite of its scale, not only participates, but I think indeed molds the template for how we move through and select directions for our itineraries and patterns within cities. Thank you.